This CyCast is provided to you by the Iowa State Letter Winners Club, bridging the gap between legend and legacy by engaging in our past to invest in our future.
Welcome everyone to our latest CyCast, and we have a wonderful guest today, and former Iowa State assistant coach Ric Wesley. And Ric was a member of Johnny Orr's staff for 14 years at Iowa State, and he got a front row seat to the birth of Hilton Magic and the enormous success of Iowa State basketball in the 1980s and early 1990s. Ric was on the staff that had many amazing Cyclone stars like Barry Stevens, Jeff Hornacek, Victor Alexander, Fred Hoiberg, squads that helped Iowa State make 6 NCAA tournament appearances during that run. And Ric, it's so glad to see you, and welcome to the CyCast.
Well, thanks, Mike. Nice to be on with you. And Iowa State's never far from my heart, and looking forward to watching the NCAA tournament this week. So,
yeah,
great time to catch up.
Well, the first question I got to ask you, Ric, is obviously, and we kind of talked about this before we got on air, was how small staffs were back then. How did you get to Iowa State? Because your first job, you were just like a volunteer assistant. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I went to Central Michigan, and we used to play University of Michigan when Coach Orr was there. And, once a year we'd go down there, and he'd kind of kick our tail around a little bit. And I was a student assistant during my time at Central. Always knew I wanted to be a coach of some kind. And then when I graduated my senior year, we actually had a guy on our staff, John Robinson, whose brother Mike, John had played at U of M for Coach Orr. His brother Mike came to U of M and then transferred to Central. And then John came with him as an assistant coach. And then when Coach Orr got the job at Iowa State, John Robinson actually left Central and came to Iowa State that first year. So I still remember I was student teaching, and I still remember picking up the Grand Rapids paper and seeing that Coach Orr had taken the Iowa State job. And I had been writing letters to various schools about trying to be a graduate assistant coach and getting some rejections. And I thought, well, there's Johnny Orr. He's going to Iowa State. I'll bet you he doesn't have anybody in mind. And then sure enough, John Robinson came along, so that was my contact. So through John Robinson, the coaches at Central Michigan, I basically just wore Coach Orr out with writing and trying to get my way on the staff. And eventually, about July, Charlie Harrison, who was Coach Orr's top assistant, called me and said, "Hey, I don't know what we can do for you. I don't have any money for you, but if you want to be on the staff, you can be on the staff." And so I loaded up my Comet, my little Mercury Comet, and never been to Iowa, and drove to Iowa, and that's kind of how I got there.
Yeah. Well, Ric, can you kind of put into perspective to Iowa State fans, because I think they're spoiled now. They're so used to, what we call Hilton Magic now, and but kind of put in perspective of what Iowa State basketball was like when you got here, and people kind of don't know that we weren't getting very many fans to games. We kind of had been a struggling program, and it was going to take a little while to build a team. But those early years probably were kind of tough, weren't they?
Yeah, they really were. And I remember, I remember so many things. I try not to bore you, but I remember the first day driving up to Hilton Coliseum, just being in awe of the structure. Wow, this is something else. But then pretty soon after that, I remember the first time I saw our team over in State Gym, and I wasn't so much in awe, and I was a little confused because I'm thinking, well, this is the Big 8 conference, and I'd come from the Mid-America Conference, and I'm looking, I'm thinking, I think our team at Central Michigan was better than this team. And they probably were. We had gone to the NCAA tournament twice and the NIT once while I was in school.
Yeah.
So our talent wasn't great. We had some tremendous guys: John Ness, Lefty Moore, Ron Falencheck, Doug Jones, so on and so on, John Cooter, Charles Harris. But it wasn't a super talented team, nor was it the kind of team that Coach Orr was used to. It was really sort of a bigger, slower team. So that was one of my first concerns or impressions. And then the other thing that had happened at that time is the year before, the program had sort of gone through some real turmoil. The previous coach, Lynn Nance, who was a tremendous coach and went on to do great things, had resigned, or I'm not sure what happened in the middle of the season. They had a player that threw his jersey into the crowd and walked off the crowd, Bob Fowler. Yeah, just some crazy things that happened. So the team was really in a little bit of a shell-shocked frame of mind, it felt like, in addition to maybe not having as much talent as we needed. And at that time, Iowa State hadn't been to the NCAA tournament since World War II, 40-some years, which seemed like, that was a long time ago. So it was a weird time. It wasn't a time when success was expected. There wasn't a lot of optimism. And Coach Orr really, the hiring of Johnny Orr really brought hope and optimism just by him being, and we just talk about, he was the tradition that the school needed. And right away, people started picking up in terms of interest and stuff. But we certainly weren't sold out. Yeah.
Well, and obviously Coach Orr became a celebrity in Ames right away. One of the most influential figures in Iowa State athletics history, and also, in any sport. What was it like to work with him? And what was he like behind the scenes? I think a lot of people saw him, in public, and he was just the life of the party and cracked jokes. But what was he like as a tactician and basketball coach, and as your boss?
Oh man, Mike, that's a loaded question. There's so many things. It makes me emotional just thinking about it, because I really miss him. I learned so much from him, and later on in my coaching career, I felt like I became more like him. Some of the things that in my first few years that I maybe questioned, or I didn't understand, or I didn't agree with. Later on, as I got to be an older coach, I thought, well, he really was right on that. I had come from a situation at Central Michigan. Our coach there, Dick Parfit, who was an all-time legend at Central Michigan, was very much in the old school disciplinarian, very stern, tuck your shirt in, you name it, all that kind of stuff, like most coaches were at that time. And Coach Orr was such a loose cannon. That was a big adjustment for me. And I remember even when we were at Central Michigan, we'd go down and play U of M, and his guys were going through the lineup line and taking the ball behind their back and doing dipsy-doos and stuff. And, and our guys were very, off the glass and very regimented. And then the game was starting, they'd just kick our butt because they were so loose. But that Coach Orr was that way. He was such a optimistic guy. He was the first guy in the office every day. He always was a very positive guy, very relaxed, and just upbeat. And so I think more than anything else, that's how I would describe his style of coaching. And I think the guys really fed off that. We used to talk about all the time, the guys were never mad at Coach Orr. They were mad at the assistants all the time. But Coach Orr was never the bad guy. We could be up by 30 with a minute to go, and we couldn't even get the subs in the game. But, the subs wouldn't be mad at Coach Orr. They somehow put that on us that, that was our fault that we weren't getting in there. But, Jim Hallahan, my great friend and mentor, who we've lost now, and he used to always say all the time, he said, if O, we always called him O, if O was your assistant, you'd have to fire him. Because you felt like as an assistant, our job was to kind of keep him in line, not the other way around.
Yeah. One thing that I don't think Coach Orr gets enough credit for, because we always talk about, what a larger than life personality was and all that. But, his high post offense that you guys ran, because you mentioned this earlier, you guys were more about speed, quickness. You weren't really, I think most teams in that era were playing lumbering centers and, big guys you got to score in the paint. But it was kind of the way he played is how a lot of teams are playing now. And you guys were doing it 40 years ago with the high post, the high post offense, spreading people out, getting the big guy out of the lane, backdoor cuts. And it was a lot about size wasn't as important. It was about quickness, speed, and, just kind of talk us through, like, how did he decide to play basketball that way?
Well, when he was Coach Orr was actually a great player himself back in 1944, Taylorville,
Yeah.
Illinois, one of the greatest high school teams in the history of Illinois basketball. And Dolph Stanley was his coach, who was a legendary name in Illinois basketball. And they ran up and down crazy. They didn't have a lot of size. So they really played fast. So Coach Orr, he always believed in playing fast like that. And his first years at Michigan, he had different players, Rudy Tomjanovich, Henry Wilmore, guys like that. But then he got a particular group there with Phil Hubbard, Ricky Green, Steve Grote, John Robinson, Wayman Britt, that really battled Bobby Knight in Indiana there for the national title. But during that time, his assistant, Bill Frieder, had gone to a Marquette practice. And Hank Raymond's actually ran what we call the high post offense. And Bill Frieder brought it back to Coach Orr, and they put it in, and it really worked well. Phil Hubbard was a bit of an undersized center.
Yeah, he was like 6'7", right? He was
6'7", played on the Olympic team after his freshman year at Michigan, and was really a tremendous player, but wasn't overly big. And so he had really great success with the offense at Michigan. And fast forward then a few years later when he came to Iowa State, that was his first thought. That's what we were going to run. And I remember we really struggled with it. Ron Falchuk, who was more of a traditional low post big guy, John Coonert. You just go through the whole group. The group, it really didn't fit. And I remember we went to, because what it is, it's really a positionless offense. There's two positions. You're the high post, and the other four spots are really interchangeable. So you've got to have positional flexibility. And we tried to run it, but we just didn't pass the ball well. It just didn't fit our personnel. I remember we went to the Far West Classic, and we were really struggling. And in the airport in Chicago, we dumped the offense. We went to something else. Charlie Harrison was our staff, and he was just so frustrated with it. And so we didn't run it our first couple of years, and then something happened, and we tried to play around with it. And Robert Estes started being our center a little bit more, and that fit a little bit better. But then when that first group kind of graduated, we started getting some of our own guys, David Moss and Sammy Hill. Those guys were a little bit more versatile, big guys.
Yep.
And then our best players were our small players, Ronnie Harris and Terrence Allen, and of course Jeff Hornacek, and that group fit perfectly into that offense. So, I still get calls all the time about it, and I tell people, I said it's like being married to somebody for 40 years. I've had a relationship with this offense for 40 years. Some years have been good, some years not so good. Some years it's been primary, some years it's been secondary.
Yeah.
But it's a fun offense. And I think it reflected Coach Orr's attitude, because it's very much a team offense. Everybody's involved, and you got to share the ball. You got to move. You got to cut, and it really rewards the hardest workers. And so over the years, Dana Altman adapted it at Creighton, had great success, and has taken it on and done some with it at Oregon. And of course, Brad Underwood started running it. Stephen F. Austin took it to Oklahoma State, ran quite a bit at Illinois. He's gotten away from it a little bit now, but so it's sort of a cool thing, because across the country there'll be these little places or pockets, and coaches will call me, and there's a little bit of a family of high post offense guys, and they all talk about Coach Orr.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, Rick, the early years were probably tough for you guys to get recruits into Ames. They had not a great tradition in history. But how important it was for you, and some of those early classes, to get guys like Ron Harris, Terrence Allen, and Barry Stevens, because I think those three guys, were part of your early classes, and then they just fit in perfectly in how you guys wanted to play there in that style, didn't they?
Yeah, our first staff, Charlie Harrison, who's now passed away, was a great mentor of mine, was kind of Coach Orr's right-hand man, and was really a great coach, and a guy who really did a lot to get the foundation established in terms of playing hard and defense. And then Gary Cook was our primary recruiter, and Gary was from the Chicago area, So our first 2 years, we really were in Chicago heavy recruiting. And Gary in that first year got Ronnie Harris. And a big plug here for Ronnie Harris, because I still don't think he's gotten the recognition. And anybody who played or was part of the program will tell you this. Ronnie Harris was just so important to everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was the best player. He was the hardest worker, the best competitor. He recruited every single guy we had to come to campus. He was the host. And, you know, he really set the tone. And so that was a really key guy. And then shortly thereafter, I guess it was the second year, we got one of the biggest breaks ever. Gary Cook was in Chicago recruiting during the holidays and was at, I think, the Proviso West Holiday Tournament, and saw John Hornacek, who was a referee who Gary knew, and remembered his son Jeff, and asked Johnny, "What's Jeff up to?" He said, "Well, no, not doing much. He's just at home. He at one time was going to go to Cornell of the Ivy League, and I don't know, that kind of fell through. And then Western Michigan was a possibility, and so he didn't really know what he's doing." And Gary said, "Well, hey, we're not very good. Why don't you have him come out and walk on?" And so I think it was the winter break of our second year, I believe.
I think that's right. Yep.
I still remember Jeff's family driving up there to Hilton because our offices were there. And, he came in and joined our team, and man, my scout team immediately got a lot better. I used to have him on my scout team, and we had a couple of guys that were more highly recruited. And I think I'll take Jeff. Jeff, hey, come on, because he could just follow directions. And then at the end of that year, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little off tangent here, but Charlie Harrison left, took the East Carolina job, and Jim Hallahan came in. And I still remember watching our guys work out one day over in Beyer Hall. And I was with Jim and showing him around. This is our team, and this is who this guy is, so on and so forth. And I said, and that's Jeff Hornacek. I said, he's a walk-on, but he's pretty good. I remember I didn't have the strength of my conviction to say, hey, he's really good, but he's pretty good. So you kind of thought, man, this guy's. It was confusing. How could this guy be so much better than everybody else?
Yeah.
But so that was a big break. And then I think at the same time, right around that same time, at the end of the year, we got a call from Michigan. It wasn't that we were recruiting Barry Stevens, but his high school coach, Grover Kirkland, called Coach Orr because he had known Coach Orr from University of Michigan and recommended Barry. And I still remember Barry coming on the visit. I was with Coach Orr. We picked him up at the airport in Des Moines and went to Babe's, like we always went to Babe's. And Babe was just great. We were eating dinner there, and I remember just talking to Barry, and his personality was, at that time, Magic Johnson had just played, and I remember thinking, man, this guy, it was his personality that attracted me more than anything else. And so we were able to get him, and man, those were two. Really, those are three guys: Ronnie, Barry, and Jeff were really key guys to getting that thing going.
Well, and in year three, first couple of years you're taking baby steps. You're getting your guys in, and getting better every year. And then year three. In my opinion, one of the most iconic games in Iowa State history was when Barry scored 40 against number 10 Missouri, last second buzzer beater shot in overtime. Probably one of your first significant wins. And you look back now, and I know that it's like I think there's a lot of people think that was the birth of Hilton Magic that day, and I'm going with it. I agree with it. But how significant was that game for you guys? Because it had to have been it had to have been that first, like, the door started cracking open. Like, we can do this here.
Yeah, it's funny because I've thought about this a little bit because I had a feeling you're going to ask that question. I don't really think about that game like that. I think about the process that got to that.
Yeah.
And the first game we had, we beat Drake. and we dogpiled at half court, if you can imagine. That was for Coach Orr's first win. That was such a big win to beat Drake in Hilton Coliseum, if you can imagine, because they had really had some good teams with Lewis Lloyd,
oh, absolutely,
Pop Wright, and
yeah.
Guys like that. So it was a slow process, and then, somewhere in there, at the end of the year, maybe you could look it up, our second or third year, we won 2 of 3 games, and one of those games was winning at Kansas. And I remember, Kansas wasn't real good, but that was maybe the only time we ever won at Kansas. But we finished the season with a little bit of momentum, and that was big. And then that year of the Missouri game, I think it was the same year, we beat Minnesota in overtime. And Brewers 7-4, and that was an unbelievable game. I remember David Moss getting the tip in overtime. Tom Peterson came off the bench and had some good moments. So we had these little steps of growing in our belief, and our crowd was right there with us each step of the way. They started feeling the energy, and then, so I guess you could say maybe the Hilton Magic started, but that was sort of the culmination. And then that particular game, going back to our first year, when they had a big guy named Steve Stepanovich, who was sort of a notorious bad guy. And at one point in the game, he had taken the ball and hit Lefty Moore on top of the head with the ball, and they didn't call a foul. And Coach Orr, I struggled with the officials a little bit, got up and was arguing. And I remember he went toward the scores table, and then he just kept going. And he walked all the way out to the free throw line at the other end to yell at the official. And that was big, because it showed our fans and our players, we're not taking this. We deserve a level of respect. Yeah. So all those things happened. And then we got to that Missouri game, and they were thought to be sort of unbeatable. And
John Sundvold, Steve Stepanovich.
John Sundvold,
Ricky. It was a great team.
Yeah, Ricky Frazier.
And I do think that team, I think they actually got upset by Iowa that year to go to the Sweet 16. But they were like a 1 or 2 seed. I think they were like a 1 or 2 seed. Yeah.
And Norm Stewart was sort of the Bobby Knight of the Big Eight. He was really year in, year out. They had great teams. So, but that particular game, we just played great, and Barry was on fire, and I think Ronnie too. I think if you go back and look, and again, it could be wrong, but it seemed like we scored like 45 points or something in the second half, and Ronnie Harris and Barry scored like 40 of them or something like that. But I remember in that game, obviously the shot that Barry made at the end was what you see all the time. But I remember at one point in the game, Barry came by the bench on a fast break, and he always dribbled the ball with his left hand. He was a right-handed player, but he came by that bench. He was going so fast. It was almost like being at the Indy 500. You almost had to feel like you sat back on the bench, like, wow, he was moving there, and took it in for a dunk, and so that was an unbelievable win. And then at the end, we had to time out, and we executed what Coach Allen called our 5-play. We kind of screwed it up. Ronnie Harris kind of went in the wrong place, but for a sec ever, the calm presence that he was able to find Barry with a perfect pass, and Barry knocked it in. I still remember, going in the locker room and calling my parents from the locker room, and back in Michigan, it was such an emotional thing, and such a great win for our program. But so maybe that is the start of Hilton Magic, but there was a lot of steps involved along the way, and I think the Coach Orr's personality, the infectious feeling you got from him, the nature of our undersized team, all just it was just exciting. It was just exciting, and each of those steps added to that excitement.
I kind of want to talk more about Barry. I've always tried to tell people who maybe didn't watch him play that he would have been. I mean, he was ahead of his time, in my opinion. I mean, I think about he would fit in so wonderfully in today's game of speed and, I mean, he was 6'5", and back then 6'5" guys couldn't shoot it like that, and he was so fast. But like, how much fun was it to watch him? Because even as a kid growing up watching him, I remember saying to myself, I don't see many players like this playing, because not only could he shoot it from long range, but he was really, people kind of don't give him credit for how skilled he was driving and scoring in the paint, beating people, on fast breaks, and just because he had a motor like I've never seen.
Yeah, he sort of was that way in life. If you knew his personality, after this, after he got done playing and stuff, we stayed friends. And he actually helped him get a job as a coach at Eastern Illinois, and he'd call me on the phone and stuff. And there was times I'd look down my phone. Oh, it's Barry. I don't have time to talk, because I knew this was going to be an hour, because Barry loved to talk, and he had that type of energy. And there were so many days in practice. I remember, being in practice sometimes when we'd be going long, 2 hours into practice or something. All of a sudden, the guys would just start chuckling or shaking their heads, and you'd stop and you'd think, well, what's going on? You realize, well, Barry's made about 30 shots in a row. This is ridiculous, you just, after a while, you just kind of took it for granted that, he just had a picture perfect shot. And he and Jeff Hornstock at that time were just phenomenal shooters, and we didn't have the 3-point line. And that would have made a big difference in their how valuable they were and how they were perceived as players. But again, Barry, his personality was a big part of everything. And Ron, and it's hard for me to think of Barry without Ronnie, because Ronnie Harris kind of tempered that. Ronnie was the, tough sergeant of arms, going to guard the best player. He was going to take on the biggest challenge. And Barry was kind of the silly, guy over here who was going to provide the spark and the fun and the offense. And they really worked well together. And once we got Barry, Ronnie's offense kind of, took a back seat, but they were best of friends. And that combination, they were just, both of them just so much fun to be around. And, Barry, I miss Barry. He was one of those guys, every conversation was just fun. And I really got to know Barry's family well, because, he, 2 years later, we were recruiting Jeff Greer. And Jeff Greer's wife is Barry's sister, Rhonda. So at the time, I'd go to Flint. I couldn't necessarily go to Jeff Greer's house, but I could go to Barry Stevens' house because he was on our team. And Barry, came from a family of lots of women. There's Beverly and Norma and Barbara and Rhonda. And I think he's got 5 or 6 sisters and 2 brothers, big family, his mom and his dad. They were just wonderful people. But his sisters were just like him. They all are really talkers. Yeah, and they were really, really fun to be around.
Yeah. Well, Rick, and year 4 was a huge year. You make the NIT. It's the first postseason tournament appearance in 40 years. I guess it'd be 40 years. Yeah. And but one game I want to talk about during that season was the double overtime win over Iowa and Hilton. And it was a first win over Iowa since 1977. I think people forget that. And Iowa was a hell of a program during that time. Lute Olson and George Raveling. I mean, they had really, really turned the corner. But what do you remember from that game? Because to finally beat Iowa in double overtime at home. And I obviously I was not at that game, but I've heard stories that was one of the loudest it had been in a long time in Hilton, and had to been another huge step for your program.
Yeah, anytime you played Iowa, that was a big deal. And Coach Orr didn't shy away from that either. I remember our first year we went to Iowa, and Coach Orr had made some comment, I think, at Michigan about going to Iowa is like a picnic or something like that. Yep. and which was probably not the best thing to say, but and so when we came out after pregame talk, there was a picnic basket out there in front of our bench, and Lute, they really played that up.
Yeah.
And they just thumped us like a drum. They had come off. I think they were just coming off their Final Four team, and so our first couple of years, weren't good. We didn't have the talent to match up with them. But then by that fourth year, and I remember Jeff Hornacek in particular, there was something about his attitude about playing them. He had a belief that we could beat them. And I remember.
And I think he had 14 assists in that game.
Yeah.
If you remember correctly.
I can remember him late in the game making a couple passes that were just phenomenal. That you didn't even that it led the player to be open, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think he lobbed one to Ronnie Virgil, and I think he lobbed another one to Barry or somebody. Just phenomenal passes and presence of mind and composure. And I think it might have been George Raveling. Then he said something. Getting beat was worse than death or something that. He had some comment like that. But that was awesome. That was just awesome. And then I think we went back and beat them the next year, maybe
at Iowa City.
At Iowa City when Jeff Greer and Gary Tompkins were freshmen. And they just didn't know any better. They just said, well, we'll just go over and win. Yeah. Like it was nothing. But, we that was sort of something that we had highlighted on the calendar. Coach Orr talked about. We had great respect for the program. But, times were changing, and we were no longer just a given for them.
Yeah. Well, heading into the 1984-85 season, which was a breakout year for Iowa State basketball, but one of the huge reasons why it was is that you guys did an amazing job in the recruiting trail, and you got arguably two of the best players. I mean, one of the best recruiting classes at the time in Iowa State history when you got Jeff Greer and Gary Tompkins, and both those guys started right away and were key. How huge was that for your staff to get those two guys for that next year, which would have been now Barry Stevens' senior year and Jeff Hornacek's junior year?
Yeah, that was big. That was my first year really as being the primary recruiter. And so I'm from Michigan. And so I went to where I felt comfortable.
Yeah.
And so we kind of moved from Chicago into Michigan more. And having had Barry, Jeff had come out to our camp when he was a sophomore. He tremendous looking kid, very quiet, hard to get him to talk. But so we had identified him. And then that summer, I remember Gary Cook left our staff, and I got promoted up, or actually that's might have been with Charlie. I can't remember how it worked. I think about that. But I got promoted up. And so I remember June 15th, I went on the road. And I don't think I came home till July 30th. It was like 2 months and a half on the road. But Jeff was really someone we really highlighted. And I still remember being up in Flint in the summer watching him. And Trent Tucker, who had played for the New York Knicks, and went to Minnesota. And was from Flint Northwestern.
He was from Flint as well, right? Yep.
Yeah, the same high school. But he was back in the summer in an open gym. And I remember Jeff was guarding him. And I remember thinking, Jeff's guarding this guy. I mean, he's shutting him down. I remember calling Jim Hallahan that night thinking, man, I tell you. I mean, I knew he was good. I thought, man, I think he's really good. And so we really went all out on him and tried to get him to commit to us in the fall. I remember he visited for an Iowa, I think it was an Iowa football game, and it was just awful weather, and it rained, and we got thumped, and it was terrible. But his high school coach would not let him sign in the fall. And, that was sort of the early signing time was a relatively new thing. So that was really disappointing because I felt like we were in great shape.
So now you had to wait till April, right?
And so now we had to wait till April. And so I just spent the rest of my my life. I think I saw him play like 20 games or something, which is difficult because that's in Michigan. So I just lived in Flint. And again, I mentioned Barry's sister, Rhonda, his cousin, Gwen. I mean, I got to know the whole family, everybody in the school, and just kind of camped out up there. Now, my parents lived 25 minutes from Flint, so that was helpful.
Okay.
I got to see some family and friends as well. But really committed to just, hey, we're going to get this kid. And it was tough because their team was a great team, maybe the greatest high school team I've ever seen. With Glenn Rice was a junior, Andre Rison was the point guard.
Isn't that just nuts how amazing that high school team was?
They were unbelievable, and they just kept winning. So the season just kept going. But I remember I got Coach Orr to fly up there with me one time, and we went to the Flint IMA. So, I remember after the game, Jeff telling us he was going to come, and that was, then we still had to hang on. We had to we couldn't sign it until April, but we got that done, and that was.
What other schools were looking at him, Rick?
Well, Minnesota, Michigan State was our big competition, and Jeff had a wonderful mom, and I think he was really close to his mom. But I think she sort of felt like it would be good for Jeff to get away a little bit. And they actually had family in Mississippi, so Mississippi State was involved too. But it really was us in Michigan State, which was really, they're right down the road. But I'd like to think we just did a better job. I know I spent a lot of time on it and, won everybody over around him. But I think in the end, his mom really liked us and Coach Orr. And I think she felt like it would be good for Jeff to get away a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was that. And then the other big recruit was Gary Tompkins in the fall. There was a lot of good players out there. And I knew Michigan was going to recruit Gary Grant. And Gary had gone to Coach Orr's camp as a young kid at U of M, Michigan. And I got to know Gary's dad. Bobby was the principal at the Jackson High School, and really got to know him well. And so we just really committed him as well, and got both of those guys. And they were, I think, second and third in Mr. Basketball voting in Michigan that year.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Rick. I mean, technically, Gary Tompkins was probably considered a higher recruit nationally than Greer was at that time, wasn't he?
Yeah, but that's hard to know. Those rankings people don't know. Jeff Greer should have been Mr. Basketball. I mean, his team won the state championship going away. He was the best player on the best team on the state championship team. But Gary probably had gone to more camps. Jeff didn't really. I remember Jeff that summer went to the Nike camp, which was a big thing. That was the first year of that camp. I think all the great players across the country. And I'm out there sweating bullets because I sort of didn't want him to play well. I think he was there 2 days and he went home. He was homesick, so he went home. Yeah. And Jeff was like that. He was pretty shy, and like I say, now, I talk to him all the time now, and he's just confident and outgoing guy. But he wasn't an easy guy to recruit too, because you had to call. I felt like you needed to call every week, and those weren't. He was just the opposite of Barry Stevens. Those weren't long conversations with Jeff. He wasn't. I almost dreaded having to call him. I know I got to call him, but I don't know what I'm going to talk about. So yeah, I think it took a long time to develop that trust factor with him.
Yeah.
And we just spent so much time on that, and committed to. We weren't recruiting a lot of kids. We were recruiting a couple kids who were recruiting really well.
Did you feel going into that 84-85 season that and once again I know for the fan out there that was the first year of the expanded 64 team NCAA tournament bracket. It had been basically 52 I think before that. So heading into that year, it was going to be 64 teams would make the NCAA tournament. Did you feel heading in that was a distinct possibility that you guys could do it?
Oh boy, I don't know if I felt anything. I was just working so hard. Yeah. I was on the road all the time, and going back and forth through airports, and I knew we had a good team. The year before we had some success, and we were starting to have more success, and having Jeff Greer and having Gary and Jeff Hornacek just gave everybody confidence. He sort of had everything under control. So I think we felt like we are now competitive. We can play. We can play with everybody now. You never know. In those days, it's funny now because all the games are on TV and stuff. But in those days, the Big Eight was as good as any conference in America. But people just didn't want to admit it. And having grown up in Michigan, I was always sensitive to the Big Ten. I got tired of hearing about the Big Ten all the time. And we were really, by all measures, better than they were. But people didn't necessarily give us that kind of recognition. So I knew we had a good team. I knew we were headed in the right direction. I think I was just more focused on can we win this next game.
Yeah. Well, that year obviously did turn out to be an amazing year for Iowa State men's basketball. Big road wins that year at Iowa, at Missouri, knocked off Kansas again, and so now you're heading down the stretch. And I kind of want to kind of let the listeners know that at that time, the Big Eight tournament, which postseason tournament, there used to be a holiday tournament, and then there was obviously the postseason tournament started in '77. And Iowa State had never made it to Kansas City in the first 8 years because the first round games were at host sites. And heading down the stretch, we're kind of on the bubble. If I don't know if they even had bracketologists back then. They probably didn't, but Iowa State was probably on the bubble, and they had to win maybe a couple games if you're going to make that NCAA tournament. And you hosted Colorado in Hilton Coliseum in the Big Eight tournament at home, and you just beat the crap out of them. And then you got to go to KC for the first time. And what's cool is I think our fans realized that was the first time how awesome it is to go to Kansas City and go to the Big Eight tournament. What do you remember from that win over Colorado to get you to Kansas City, and then when you got there, you pretty much handedly beat Kansas to go to the championship game. Did you guys feel at that time? I think we sense that we can make the tournament now.
Boy, Mike, you're asking me to dig
loaded
deep.
Question. I'm sorry, but
I got to dig deep. I have to go back and look at the stats and stuff to bring it back. But I remember just getting there was the big thing, like you say.
There were tons of Iowa State fans there, wasn't there?
Yeah. The thing about Coach Orr, he loved success. He loved the wins. He could pretty much poo-poo the losses in the bad time, but boy, he reveled in happiness. And so to get there, it was woo! This is a dinger. This is great. And then you felt like this is a bad analogy. I'm sorry, but listen to the Grateful Dead. I saw a documentary yesterday I was listening to about how they were so connected to their fans, the Deadheads. Well, we were connected to our fans. Coach Orr had somehow, or they had somehow, infiltrated into the program in a very meaningful, emotional way. So it wasn't like we were going to Kansas City. We're all going to Kansas City. And the uniqueness about Iowa, and again, I might be making this up. I used to say this, but, we had so many farmers that are fans in the wintertime, they're kind of shut down. They can't get on the fields, and they're in a different mindset. They had a little bit more free time. And to go to Kansas City was a little bit like a spring break kind of a thing. The weather typically seemed like it was always a little bit nicer there, and but when we went there, you could feel the energy. We're not going alone. We're moving the Cyclone fans down the road, and I think that was the game where Jeff Greer had the two-handed dunk over Danny Manning. Yeah, he had kind of a rip drive on the right side and went over and jumped over top of somebody. I don't remember, and that was like, oh my God. And once that happened, I thought, well, hey, we're in business here now. I can't remember. We had a couple of years in a row there, and I don't know if that was the year we got to the finals and Woody Mayfield, referee made traveling call on Sam Hill. Otherwise,
that was '86. Yeah.
Yeah, we would have won the tournament. Well, we had about 2 or 3 years in a row there. We went down to Kansas City and really did well, and that kind of established Kelly's as the place to hang out.
Yep. And it started 40 years ago, didn't it?
And the hotels were awesome, and the Hereford House is where we ate, and we developed a real routine for our team and for our fans that I think exists to this day.
Yeah.
And it was Kansas City is such an awesome town to have that host. I was gone after they started moving into Dallas and moving into Oklahoma City. I'm like, oh, come on, what are you doing? Why are you messing with that? So
I think they realized they made a mistake there, and I think they're doing the right thing where it's at now, and I hope it never leaves.
But you're right, we hadn't been there to get there. You had to start somewhere, so that first time we went was really a big deal.
Yeah, so you make the championship game, you play a great Oklahoma team with Wayman Tisdale, and it goes right down to the wire. But so now Selection Sunday hits, and your name's called, and once again, Iowa State fans don't know this. I mean, or some do, but the younger ones don't. 41 years it had been since Iowa State made the NCAA tournament. I just can't imagine. I wish I was in town at that time to feel the excitement. And if you have any recollections and memories of what those first 2-3 days was like living in Ames, Iowa, when you guys finally broke open that door to make the NCAA tournament.
Well, the funny thing when I think about that, I always think about my first couple of years at Iowa State. We really didn't have a lot of tradition, and I think in the media guide there might have been that picture of that team in 1940 whatever, the last team that had gone to the 44 that had gone to the tournament. And I remember I used to look at that picture like, man, that's a long time ago. And then I started talking. I'm kind of a history guy. I started talking to people about them. Like, well, what was that team all about? Well, the best player on that team, if you look at that picture, was a guy named Bryce
Brookfield.
Bryce Brookfield. Yeah.
Bryce
and
Brookfield.
You look at this picture, and I think the Weedy brothers are on there, who are great guys. They're a couple of young cherub-looking Iowa farm boys. Then you got this guy Bryce, who's this big monster guy. He looks like he's about 40 years old.
Well, I think he was 24 or 25.
And the story with those were the World War II days, and he had been like an All-American player in eastern New Mexico or someplace, gone into the service, got out of the service, and somehow, because the rules were lax, was able to come to Iowa State. And so you had this big monster guy that, I was thinking, well, how difficult is it to get the instant? That's not going to happen for us. We're not going to get a guy like that, But I used to look at that picture and think, wow, this is really a challenge to get there. So that was certainly our goal. And then to get there, again, it just was all exciting. It was all, and it all was increments, beating Minnesota, beating Missouri, getting the NIT, getting the NCAA tournament. We just were on a good trajectory. And the good thing about Coach Orr had such a job stability. There was never a question of fans. I think even now with talk radio and the internet, everybody's a critic. There was no critics. I mean, we won 9 games and we were loved. That almost can't happen anymore. So I think we went, 9 games, 10, 13, 15, something like that.
Yep.
But it was a slow build, but each step was important. Each step was exciting. Each step was appreciated. And again, we were all in the crowds just kept getting bigger and bigger and more enthused. And so by the time we went to the second time there, we went to the Sweet 16, we were just in a frenzy, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, before we go into that season, which was one of the greatest in Iowa State history, I want to go back to Coach Orr. What are your favorite and you may not be able to tell them on this CyCast, Johnny Orr stories of working the officials, because I think people maybe have noticed it, but they don't really know like how much he probably disliked officials.
I don't know if he really disliked anybody. He just was sort of he was he reveled in the spotlight. He was very much a player's coach. And again, I got 40 years of my own yelling of officials. So I'm going to defend him here a little bit, because I wasn't great on officials either. But I feel like he didn't really ever want to yell at our guys. And so a lot of that is just, you watch coaches on the sideline, a lot of it is just nervous energy. So, as your guys screw up, you don't want to yell at your guys, so you need some outlet. And next thing you know, you kind of yell at the officials. And I think that was a little bit of a Coach Orr. And, and he definitely was a showman kind of a guy, so some of it was to get the crowd going. And so he really had a really pretty good relationship with a lot of the officials. Now, we had a couple tough years there, one of which we alluded to with the call at the end of the Oklahoma game with Woody Mayfield, where he probably missed or inadvertently called a travel call, and that was that was hard to get over that one.
Yeah.
But and some of the officials during that time too, I would say, were big personalities themselves. John Dambro was a guy. Ed Hightower, they were kind of showmen as well. So it wasn't always as bad as it would look from the sideline.
Yeah.
Although the time when Coach Orr went all the way out to the free throw line the other end, that was legitimately, he was upset about that. But he was quick to let it go after the game. He wasn't one to hold a grudge or
yes, exactly.
And I read something just the other day, made me think about Coach Orr, because the Pistons, I'm a Pistons fan. They had a 5 technical game, and the opposing coach for Oklahoma City made a comment. They said, well, we knew from looking at our analytics that this particular crew was going to be a kind of a loose crew. And it made me think about Coach Orr, because there was a period of time when we had a guy, a math professor at Iowa State, Dr. Knicker, I think his name was. And he
Charles
had
Knicker. Yep.
Yeah, he had developed a system of grading the officials that was really pretty accurate. And he probably wasn't good for Coach Orr, but he shared that with Coach Orr. And, he would tell you a given crew would come in, and he would say this particular referee is going to make 60% of the calls, and this one's going to make 30%. And this one tends to do that. He had all these tendencies, and he really had mapped it out in a pretty good way. And Coach Orr used to always talk to our league official commissioner about using. Of course, they wouldn't do it then. But when I heard this NBA guy talk about it the other day, I'm like, well, why is it? Why don't we have that? I mean, they're just like anybody else.
Yeah.
And he had a way of charting a controversial call and what made it a controversial call. So, anyways, I thought about Coach Orr the other day. But sometimes officials, they make mistakes, but he would let them know. But again, he wasn't one to carry a grudge, and he would move past it pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I've heard that through the years, and I just want to share one story I heard about Coach Orr and officials. I don't know if you remember a Big 8 official at that time named Jim Murphy. I don't know if you remember him, but he did a lot of our games, 80s, Coach Orr early, and well, just by chance, he was also a baseball coach at Davenport Assumption, I believe, and then he became our assistant baseball coach for a couple years.
Oh, okay.
So I got to know him really well, and I remember talking to him on a road trip, and I didn't know he was an official. He said, "Yeah, I used to do a ton of Big 8 games. I did a lot of Iowa State games, and right away I go, all right, tell me about Coach Orr." And he told me the funniest story. He said, "Well, yeah, he would be on you every single game, but you never took offense to it. It was more kind of funny." And he said he'd be on you the whole game, and he'd sometimes tell you stuff that you kind of laugh, or like, I can't believe he just said that to me. But he said there was one game, he's doing an Iowa State game, and he noticed that Coach Orr wasn't really on him. He wasn't He wasn't saying anything to him. And he was kind of like, what's going on here? So there's a timeout, and he goes over to the bench and goes, hey, Johnny, are you okay? You haven't basically berated me today. You haven't said anything negative about my family today or anything like that. And Coach Orr goes, Murph, I'm sorry. I don't feel good today. And so Murph, he would tell me that story. I laughed so hard. He apologized. He apologized for not berating him.
Not doing his job. Huh?
Not doing his job. But
the amazing thing about Coach Orr, and I used to, I thought about this a lot over the years too, is, he was really a great listener. And, each year I was there when I first started, I was a graduate assistant, and it would be Coach Orr, Charlie Harrison, Gary Cook, John Robinson, and then me. Okay. And then after a year, then I moved up a chair. And then a couple years later, but I remember each time I moved up, I remember, as assistants, you got a nonstop dialogue going on during the game and stuff. And I remember as I got closer to him, I'd be talking to Jim Hallahan about something, and Coach Orr would leave, what's that? It made me nervous, like, whoa, now all of a sudden what I say really matters here, and he's really listening. And he would really take in the information on the bench from the staff, and he had no ego that way. He was really a good listener. And then you jump up and have all these theatrics, and he'd sit back down and tune right back in. He always wanted to keep it pretty simple. But again, over the years, I really thought about, as a head coach, being able to listen. And I used to tell my staff that all the time. Hey, come at me with facts now. Come at me with facts. Let's try to keep the emotion out of it, because I'm emotional enough. But he was really good that way. Yeah. I remember one time being in the Far West Classic. I can't remember exactly what he said, but we that was our first year, maybe our second year, but we were in the 7th, 8th place game, I think, or something. And I remember him just chewing out this one official and making some comment like, hey, there's a reason why you're in the. He said, I know we're bad, but there's also a reason why you're in the 7th place game. Something to that effect. And the guy gave him a technical. I'm like, well, he's probably right. The referees are graded into this tournament just like the teams. And you fall into the 8th place game. That doesn't speak well to you. But he had, we had some great ones. Ron Spittler and was a great official that we really liked. And so he definitely was a showman that way. Well, and didn't really didn't get that many technicals either.
No, he didn't, did he? Really? No. Yeah. Obviously the 85-86 season was very memorable, and we could talk about a million games from that year that were so special. But let's kind of speed up to the end of the year. And once again, I mean, that was the first time ever that Iowa State had been undefeated in Hilton Coliseum. 9-5 record in the Big 8. You make the championship game of the Big 8 tournament again, and then now you get kind of a better seed, and you got Miami, Ohio, first round, and you're playing in the Metrodome. And man, there were a lot of Iowa State fans there that day, and I was there. I was one of them. And people forget how good Miami, Ohio was. They had Ron Harper, and that goes to overtime. And then talk about that play where you set up Jeff Hornacek for the buzzer beater. It's, you got to admit, it's probably one of the most iconic shots in Iowa State NCAA tournament history. But that was a design play for him all the way, wasn't it?
Yeah, he came off a little baseline screen. I think Gary Tompkins threw the ball in, and Jeff kind of came off on the baseline and curled up and met the pass, and it was good. It was on the left side of the floor, so Jeff was kind of turning right into his shot. And it's funny because, again, we didn't have the 3-point line at that time, but most of Jeff's shots were really long shots. And had we had a 3-point line, we would have encouraged him to shoot more, probably. But at that time, it was sort of thought that, well, that's sort of too far out a lot. But in that particular case, I mean, he had no problem getting the shot there and knocked it right in. And that was such a huge thing. that particular game, the head coach from Miami, Ohio, was a guy named Jerry Pearson, who was a great guy, who had been Jim Hallahan's college teammate at Miami, Ohio. Coach Hallahan had played at Miami, Ohio,
Yeah.
so there was a lot of connection there between the two programs. And we had Jeff Greer, they had Ron Harper, and little I want to say Manny Newsom was their little point guard, who was a good little player. Ed Schillings, who's going on to be a college coach, was on that team. And what I remember is after Jeff made the shot, you flashed the TV screen, flashed to the bench, and actually Ed Schilling's dad is.
I know what you're talking about. He just puts his head down, doesn't he?
He just drops his head like he just been. So we probably not nice to laugh about that, but we got a kick out of that, and it was really. I remember for Coach Hallahan, it was really sort of an emotional thing because Jerry Pearson, the coach, was one of his very best friends. In fact, Jerry Pearson came out to Ames and spoke at Jim's funeral a couple of years ago. So that was there was a lot of that in there. But what a great shot by Jeff, and really a great pass by Gary Tompkins. And that's one of the things that made that team so special is we almost had 2 point guards, and both Jeff and Gary were tremendous passers. I used to think that Gary was our point guard in transition on the full court, and Jeff was our point guard on the half court. Yep. And that combination just made that team really click well.
Yeah.
But
when you talked about the connections that you just had for the Miami Ohio game, and think about the connections now you have for the next game when you play Michigan, who is I guess they were the 2 seed overall, right? I think that year, one of the 2 seeds. So Coach Orr's playing his former assistant, Bill Frieder, place where he coached for many, many years, and a very good team, loaded with talent. Yeah. Going into that game, did Coach Orr, was he tempered in talking to the guys about like how special that game maybe could have been for him?
Oh, no, he never would have brought that up, but he didn't need to either.
Yeah.
And, the other thing is we had a lot of Michigan guys, both Jeff Greer and Gary Tompkins. I think Daryl Spinks was on the team at that time, Maurice Poole from Jackson. We had Eli Parker. We had at least there's 5 guys I can think of real quickly that were from Michigan, and most of the other guys from Illinois. So we had really kids that had grown up in the Big Ten world. And Michigan, if you remember, I mean, they were Big Ten champs, and they were just a giant team. I mean, Tarpley, Richard Relford, Butch Wade. I mean, just these big, strong, brute, Antoine Jobert, Gary Grant. I mean, just giants. And so
Glenn Rice as a freshman off the bench.
And Glenn was a freshman off the bench. Mike Griffin, who had played with David Moss in high school, was on the bench there. So just so many ties and so many connections, and such a great opportunity. And we're up there in Minneapolis, and we've got it's Cyclone North, it's Hilton North. I mean, we had a tremendous group. I remember being in a hotel between games. My niece Lauren, just the other day, she was born. I remember that because she just had her birthday. But it was just such a great opportunity. And, we were confident, but I'd also say, we were a little, I don't want to use the word afraid, but, you're anxious. And my experience over the years is a lot of times the best games you play are when you are a little bit unsure of the result or a little bit afraid. You got to be on top of your game. And I remember in that particular game, we had 3 different guys, Gary Tompkins, Ronnie Virgil, and Elmer Robinson. All 3 of those guys got dunks in that game. And I don't know that Gary and Virgil had gotten a dunk all year. And, so I used to tell my team this, when you get into these, the farther along you get into the tournament, you've got to do things you've never done before. You've got to do special things because these are special games. And that's what happened in that game. And then, the way it worked out was they were so big and we were so small. It was inevitable. They had some we had bad matchups, But they had a really
they had bad matchups too.
They had a really bad matchup, and one of those big guys had to guard Ronnie Virgil. And Ronnie Virgil was 6'2", 6'2.5", 150 pounds. And we used to joke about it all the time because of the national media. All these publications and stuff would rank Jeff Greer. He'd be like the 5th best small forward in America, and so on and so forth. And I used to say, well, if Greer's our small forward, I guess that makes Verge our big forward at 6'2", 150.
Yeah.
And in that game, and you talk about the high post offense, there's a time when you kind of come off a ball screen right at the elbow, and Verge would come off there, and their big guys just didn't know how to guard that. And Verge was a really good mid-range shooter. And I think Verge went 7 for 8 in that game. Yeah. And early in that game, Dick Stockton, who was on the doing the game on TV, I think referred to Verge as the Twig. He called him the Twig, and kind of mocking him a little bit. And then as the game went on, more and more that twig grew into a big redwood tree, and he was pretty doggone good. So that was a tremendous, tremendous victory for us. And the other thing is, Coach Orr was sick as a dog that day. Yeah. I remember we were really worried he wouldn't be able to get out of the locker room because he had a touch of the flu. And I remember him sitting there was a locker in the locker room. He's kind of sitting inside the locker room. He could barely move. And the floor was a raised floor in the Metrodome. So, we almost had to push him up onto that floor because he was not feeling well at all that day. And so those are the things I remember. And then the last thing I'll share with you about that game is that year before, after, because Jeff Greer was a sophomore. So, that year before, when after Jeff, I'd gone up and tried to spend the same amount of time recruiting Glenn Rice. Yeah. And Glenn had actually committed to us in the fall, and then his coach wouldn't let him sign. So we had to wait till the spring again. And then over the course of the year, all of a sudden Michigan decided to recruit him and so on. So, but I was up there all year. And we really got involved with Jeff's church. Glenn was really involved with his church there. And that's another story for another day. But Coach Orr and Coach Allen and I, we all went to the church service and stuff. But got to know his pastor. His pastor was Pastor Bogan, and the deacon was Brother Dumas, was the guy we were dealing with, talking to him a lot. And I remember the last time going up there at the church step, we couldn't find Jeff's, or Glenn. Somebody kind of grabbed Glenn and stuck him away somewhere. But I remember Brother Dumas telling me, hey, just get out of Dodge. The family wants everybody to get out of Dodge. And I'm like, okay, anyway, so fast forward to that game, and 30,000 people. We win the game going away, and I remember as I'm walking off the floor, somebody grabs me by the arm, and I turn around and it's Brother Dumas. Brother Dumas was at the game. Okay. Michigan, we sure took care of him. But I remember, Glenn should have come to us, Yeah. But that was a great win, just a great win. And then we turned around, and I remember coming back to the airport in Ames was just packed with people, and that was for Coach Orr, that felt like the culmination of everything. Again with the Michigan background that I had, Coach Orr had, our players had. Man, that was huge. And then we had to turn around and go right back down Highway 35 again.
You went to Kansas City. You went to back to KC, yeah. And unfortunately, NC State was loaded. I think there was like 7 NBA players on that team. I tried to count one day. I think it was like 7.
Yeah, they had big Shackelford and Washburn and Nate McMillan.
Del
Negro. Yeah, Pete Myers was on that team.
Pete Myers.
And we just didn't play well. We played okay, but we just didn't play well. But it had been such an emotional roller coaster for about 2.5 weeks. And even, like the other day with Iowa State getting knocked out of the Big 12 tournament, sometimes it's not bad to get out of those tournaments right away. So you save some emotional energy for the NCAA tournament. I'm hoping that's the case this year for the Cyclones. So, but that was a great run for us, and certainly those are great memories.
Well, Rick, I'm gonna just fast forward a couple of years. I once again, I could talk to you for 4 hours, and I know most people don't want to listen to that. But 2 years later, one of the most memorable games in Iowa State history occurred when you had a guy named LaFesta Rhodes who really didn't play much in his career until his senior year, but he was on all those teams. He was a role player, didn't play a ton, and then boom, the 87-88 season, you guys put him in at center. He was a very unorthodox center, but he could run everyone off the court. And then we get to the Iowa game, and Iowa is and talking about NBA players, I think Iowa had like 7 NBA players on that team with Roy Marble and Ed Horton and B.J. Armstrong. We can go on the list. And it's one of the most epic games in school history. It was a double overtime, right? It was double overtime, 102-100, and LaFesta Rhodes scores 54 points. You probably have 500 memories from that game. What are some of your best ones?
Well, we touched a little bit about the high post offense. LaFesta really struggled to play in the high post offense. LaFesta idolized Barry Stevens. Barry kind of took him under his wing. He wanted to be Barry Stevens, but he didn't have the jump shot. He wasn't anything like Barry. But in the high post offense, we really struggled to play LaFesta because you talk about energy now. Barry had energy. LaFesta was hyper energy. And, actually, he won the state championship in Tennessee in the half mile, ran like a 150 half mile or something.
Yeah, and was actually on our track team.
And ran on the track team, ran at the Drake relays. But LaFesta was kind of crazy. We'd put him in at the end of games when we had a big lead, and he'd be a one-man full-court press. He scored 10 points in 1 minute, and the coaches from the other teams would be mad at him because the game was over. It's like, hey, call off the dogs. But that's how he was. He only had one way, and it was all out. But when we tried to play him in the high post offense, he didn't really fit because he wasn't a good screener, and he was a bad passer. He couldn't pass the ball. And so, we really struggled to find a way to play him for his first few years. And I'll go back a little bit. Stop me if I go on too long. But Elvie Everidge was a good friend of mine. And people that are around Iowa State knew Elvie. Elvie had played football at Iowa State and then worked in the admissions office. And Elvie's job was that he went around the Midwest and recruited minority students who were really talented students and was able to offer them scholarships and so on and so forth. And so a lot of the minority students that came to Iowa State during those days were directly tied to Elvie. And in fact, Barry Stevens' wife, Sarita, was Miss Gary, Indiana. She came to Iowa State because she was one of Elvie's recruits. But Elvie, during his time there, was really responsible for 2 players, one being Mark Urquhart, who was a great player for us and is now a surgeon in New Jersey, and LaFesta. Elvie was down in Memphis at a college fair, so on and so forth, and he came back and said, hey, there was this kid down there, a small school kid. People are telling me about him. I went and saw him. I think he's pretty good. And next thing you know, we recruited him. So those were Elvie's 2 recruits. I always said, and Elvie's passed away, but what a great friend he was to all of us. So LaFesta comes in. He's a little wild, loved him to death, great energy, but couldn't really play it. And so then going into that year, we had lost Sam Hill, David Moss. Victor Alexander was coming in as a freshman.
Yep.
We thought Victor was really talented, but didn't know if he was going to be ready. And so somewhere along that, we didn't really have much of a choice. We're going to have to go with LaFesta. Well, how are we going to do this? Because LaFesta likes to shoot too much. So we changed our offense that year. We scrapped the high post offense. We went to what's called the triangle offense. It was a little bit of a Lute Olson offense. And basically, if you drew a triangle from the top of the key down to the block, and back, that's the triangle. And it kind of confines your 3 big guys to that area, and then your guards play on the outside. So our thinking was, okay, if LaFesta shoots every single time he touches the ball, at least we've got him in a confined area. So let's go with this. And
Yep.
then let's really commit to running the ball. And that's how we're going to try to play. And Terry Woods was our point guard, who was probably not so much quick, but his ability to change directions was unbelievable, and could really handle the ball. And so that's what we decided to do. And our first part of practice was chaotic, and Coach Orr was just saying, "Go, go, go!" We're throwing the ball over the gym, but we sort of started getting it. And what LeFester could do as a big guy was really run, and he was a difficult matchup. And then we had a couple guys, Elmer Robinson and Paul Dorfeld. Those guys were kind of our big forwards, and they would do a lot of the dirty work. They would end up having to guard a lot of the big players on the other team. And Paul in particular was really outstanding at taking the ball out of bounds. He would get that ball and get it in quick. And so it all started coming together, and we started that year off, if you remember.
I think 16-2. We started 16-2.
Yeah, and it was Jeff Greer's senior year. We started off in the preseason NIT, and Jeff was phenomenal in that preseason NIT. We won at Purdue, but all of a sudden we really developed a rhythm of play, and that kind of culminated in the Iowa game.
Yeah.
And they like to run and press. We like to run and press. And both teams just went at it. And LeFester just got kind of lost in the action. And it just happened. It's just happening so fast that you don't even realize what's happening, really. And I remember at one point in the second half, and Coach Hallahan, he was kind of LeFester's guy, and they really had a great relationship. But Jim would get frustrated with him, but I remember one time in the second half we were talking on the bench, and Jim said to Coach Orr something like, "Hey, LeFester, he didn't guard his guys. LeFester, we need, Coach, we got to get him out of there. He needs a break." And I remember it was just like in slow motion. I remember it was one of the first years I think we had the point total on the scoreboard and all that stuff. And Coach Orr kind of, listened like he always did. And then he kind of leaned back and he kind of looked up there at that scoreboard, and he said, "Well, he's Doc." We called him Doc. He said, LeFester that was his nickname. He said, "Well, he's got 37. I think we'll let him go." Just like that.
Smart decision by the head coach.
He's got 37. Probably should roll with this guy a little bit. And so it was just a phenomenal performance. And if you can imagine getting 54 points, and it came in the rhythm of the game.
Yeah,
and
it did.
At no point did Iowa do anything to adjust. I mean, they never double teamed him. They never did. But I'm not sure what they could have done, because he got it on tip-ins. He got a couple three-pointers. He got it on fast breaks. He got it within the offense. And then if you remember, it was during a time of the Iowa caucuses, Jesse Jackson was at the game. Yeah. And I remember Jesse laughed because LeFester, he could talk. And he had a little bit of a Southern dialect accent. It was hard to understand him when he got excited. And in the post game, Jesse Jackson wanted to meet LeFester, and you could see on the TV at the scores table, Jesse Jackson's talking to LeFester. And I don't think he had any idea what LeFester was just talking so fast. Oh, that was a phenomenal night. But we had that team was really a fun team. Mike Bourne and Gary Tompkins would run the right wing, and Terry would push the ball. And I mentioned, of course, Greer was senior year, and he was phenomenal.
All-American.
And then LeFester doing what he did. And that was really a great team. And then second semester, Gary Tompkins got mono. He got mono, and he missed some games. And that really, it was one of those years where we had 5 first-round draft picks, I think, in the old Big 8. So, your margin for error wasn't great. And we never quite got it back, and then Gary came back at the end of the year. But that team, when we were clicking, you look at, I go back every so often to look at the record book, and you talk about running basketball. That team was a fast, fun team to watch.
Yeah, you didn't have Ken Palm back then, but I bet their pace would be your pace that year would have been ranked pretty way up there.
Yeah, it was unreal. But LeFester in that game, that was, if people got the old tape to watch, it's a fun one. It's a fun one to watch.
Yeah, I think most fans, Iowa State fans, would agree, and they've done it. I'm going to kind of move ahead a little bit here, Rick. 1991, kind of felt your program got a resurgence because of an amazing recruiting class that you were a big part of. So you bring in Fred Hoiberg, you bring in Lauren Meyer, you bring in Mika Leak, you bring in Hurl Beecham, but don't forget the two good junior college players in Ron Bayless and Howard Eaton. Mm-hmm. Tell us about forming that class, and then boom, it kind of gave Johnny Orr like a second win there at the tail end of his career, because that was some really good teams to end his career.
Yeah, it really did. We had a couple tough years. I feel bad, after that team we just talked about. Then Victor Alexander's years in there, and we struggled to put a good group together. We kind of had a mixed match. We had 5'9" super quick point guard in Terry Woods, and we had this 6'10" tremendous half court scorer in Victor Alexander, and that does not necessarily go together well. And then one of those years we had the most difficult schedule in America too, so that was really unfair to that group. But all those things factor in, and so we lost a little bit of momentum. And I'll always feel like Victor's a little underappreciated because of that, because he was a tremendous player. But then about that time, we over the time Coach Orr was there, we didn't really have a lot of great Iowa players. Really, Iowa basketball was not very good, and I've often said that. One year I remember Coach Orr saying that he had talked to the Northern Iowa people. Northern Iowa had been a Division II program going Division I, and Coach Orr said, "Hey, I went in the office. He said, I talked to the Northern Iowa people. We're going to go up and play in the Unidome." And I remember Coach Hallen and I, just like, sputtering about, like, what are we going to do that for? Why? That's stupid. Let's not do that. And I remember Coach Orr saying, he said, "No," he said, "we're going to do that." He said, "It's going to be a great thing." He said, "It's going to be a great thing." He said, "And it'll be good for basketball in Iowa." And
and I want to add in here, Coach, that Iowa State was the first team to ever go play UNI at UNI. And Iowa never did for years.
Yeah, we did not want to do it, but Coach Orr, he was determined that we were going to do that. He said, and I think we went up there, and I think Barry hit a shot at the buzzer to win. But from that point on, Iowa basketball got better, and then because of that, it forced Iowa to go up there and play, and then we had this mythical, state championship where all 4 Division I teams play, and it really was. It just makes me sick now that that's not still happening, because that should be happening in a state like Iowa. But I really felt like that helped basketball really grow in the state of Iowa. So fast forward, all of a sudden we got this group coming along. Chris Street kind of started it a little bit, and Horner, and there's different players that came along, but all of a sudden we had this really good group highlighted by Fred Hoiberg and Hurl Beecham and Lauren Meyer in our state. And, we really recruited Lauren early. He was a Northern Iowa kid, pretty small town kid, Ruthven, Ayrshire, went to the same school from kindergarten through senior year. And then Fred really had to work hard to get Fred. And then late Hurl Beecham had a great senior year and added Hurl to that mix. So that was a just super group. And then if you remember during that time too, Iowa State, we really had tough academic standards too. So we weren't able to recruit junior college kids like some of the other schools in our league. Us in Colorado were generally thought of as being the 2 toughest academic schools to get into. But we needed some help. And so, that was my first foray into junior college basketball. And went down to Texas and went down to look at Nick Van Exel, and his arch rival was Kilgore Junior College, and that's where Ronnie Bayless played. And Ronnie had been a pretty good student in high school. He wasn't a typical junior college player. He just was a little short on what he needed, so he went to junior college and was an excellent free throw shooter, great defender, kind of a combo guard. I really liked his junior college coach, Sean Scanlon, who's a friend to this day. And so we recruited Ron. And then actually I went down to Missouri, and I wanted to recruit a player from State Fair, Aaron Collier. And, I was having a hard time getting him, and I was talking to different people. Is there any other forwards down here? And Howard Eaton's name came up. And I went to Three Rivers Community College, and a guy named Gene Best was the coach, who's the all-time winningest coach in the history of junior college basketball. And if you look, maybe the best coach I've ever been around in my life. And I went to their practice, and Howard had hurt his knee, so he had a little bit of a gimpy knee. But the thing that stood out was what a tremendous coach this guy was. And he did things in practice I'd never seen before. And I came back just so impressed with the coach. Well, fast forward, so we get to the end of the year, and they call from Three Rivers about Howard Eaton. And the coach said, hey, Howard would like to commit to Iowa State. What do you think? Mm-hmm. And Coach Orr said, well, let me call you back. So Coach Orr calls me up and said, Rick, what do you think? Man, Coach, I don't know. I mean, he had a really bad knee, and he was kind of dragging his knee around. But I'm going to tell you what, there's nothing we can do in terms of pushing this kid that he hasn't seen before. And Coach Orr had great instincts that way. And he said, well, all right, he said, we're going to go ahead and take him. And, the rest is, Howard came and he started for 2 years, was sort of a Ronnie Harris captain, sergeant of arms, very successful man now living in Des Moines. And he was just great. And then obviously Ronnie Bayless came in, and he and Justice Thigpen, Justice was sort of a combo guard as well. So they both were kind of point guards, kind of off guards, fit in like a T. And then the freshmen were tremendous. So we thought all of them would sort of be depth. And I remember the first day we went to the track to run, and Howard Eaton won the mile run, and Julius Mikulik was right there with him. And so the new guys came in, and they immediately established themselves as the better player. And going back to ULO, my grandparents came from what's now the Czech Republic. So my last name is Wesley, but it's really Vesely, which is pretty common in the Czech language, which means happy, jolly. So, I grew up in this family where most of my dad's, all of his aunts and uncles lived in the Czech Republic. And in about 1988, my wife and I took my dad over there to the old country when it was still communist to meet his only living aunts and uncles, which was a pretty emotional thing. Wish we would have had filmed it. But so about, 90 or whatever, somewhere along that line, Bill Badley, who had been a high school coach over at Carroll High School, worked our camp and was a friend of mine. And we were talking about something. And every year he used to take a team of Iowa kids over to play in some international tournaments. And he was at a camp, and he had just gotten back, and I was asking him about, how it went. And he said, oh, real good. I said, well, did you see any good players? He said, well, yeah. He said, in fact, we got beat by the Czechoslovakian team in the finals. And right away, he said the Swedish team or the Bulgarian team, probably nothing would have happened. But, the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakia then. And I said, really? I said, do they have any good players? Oh, yeah. He said, they had the MVP was this left-handed kid, about 6'10". And I'm like, well, what was he like? And, he was kind of like Brad Lohaus, but he could dribble the ball. And we went back and forth between all of this talk. And I'm like, well, okay. And how would you, do you have any information on the kid? And how could I get a hold of the kid? And so he had a contact in England, a friend of his named Branislav Bajani, who he thought would know about the kid. So he gave me his phone number, and now this was in August, and I started calling. And, again, this is a long time ago. We didn't have, internet like we do now, and a phone call overseas was a big deal. So I had to come in the office, the time change and stuff, call different. I could never get him to pick up. And I must have called 20 times. And finally, one day he picks up. And he's a great guy. And he had been on vacation, or he had been on holiday, as they say over there, into the Slovakia area. And that's where he had been gone. And he was great. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I know the family. His dad and I played professionally together." He said, "You must come. We will talk. We will go. We will visit. We'll make the deal." And so that's kind of where we were at with it. And I'm like, okay. And so I was kind of working through him with the family, and we start making contact with the kid. And we had a guy on campus, Dr. Vondra, Charlie Vondra, who played on the football team. His dad was a professor in geology department who had grown up in Nebraska and was fluent in Czech. So he was very helpful on the phone. And Dr. Vondra would help me as I called the family. We'd talk, we'd discuss. And I did everything I could to sort of, validate that this was a good player. I knew he was a good player. But we didn't have any video. We didn't have any, it was a different world then. And, I don't think Max Yerk would have let me pay for a flight to go over there at that time. That's so different now. They wouldn't think anything of it.
Yeah.
But I'd done everything I could. It was a little bit frustrated. And I called one day and I got a hold of the kid, Yulo, and he had been selected to the national team. And they were going to come to the United States and play exhibition games here in the United States. Awesome. Okay, awesome. And it just so happened one of those games was at Iowa. So that worked out great. So he came over and he's playing these games. And I went to the Iowa game and I set up a time that I could pick him up after the game and have him come visit. And so I was able to go scout Iowa. He had live scouting in those days. He played pretty good against Iowa. He guarded A.C. Earl, and he had 14 points. And I'm thinking,
so this is a 90-91 season. This would be the 90-91 season where they played him in the preseason.
Yeah, exactly.
I never knew that.
Yeah. And so then after the game, it was very awkward. I went to the hotel, and again, they're so communist during this time. And I picked him up from the hotel, and I could tell his coaches weren't real keen about that. And I drove Yulo back to Ames from Iowa City. Yulo came a long way with his English, but his English wasn't great. My Czech was very limited, to a few foods and stuff. But I had him come visit, and again, I'm still trying to figure this out. He's standing next to Victor Alexander and Phil Kuntz, and he's just as tall, if not taller than those guys. Felt pretty good about him. He was a little awkward. So we did everything we could to show him a good time. Dr. Vondra was great. And then took him back. And then from Ames, he flew to Marquette. He played at Marquette. He played at Kansas State. He played all these teams. You're following the box scores, and he's doing real well. So I had no question he's a good enough player. And then, he went back home after that. And we tried to get him to sign, but in the fall, but it got messed up. I don't think the papers arrived. You didn't have fax machines in those days, so he wasn't able. We couldn't get him to sign. But then I remember at one point, then I was able to fly over there, and I flew to London, and I got with Brandy, my buddy Branislav, and we drove to Slovakia. So we and I remember we had to go watch a game up in Manchester. We went to the cliffs of Dover. We took the boat across to Calais, France. We drove through Belgium. We got on the Autobahn. We drove all the way through Austria and finally, got to his hometown and visited with his family. And got to meet his mom and dad and his sister. And I think his sister, we kind of connected well.
Yeah.
And so then, I thought that really cemented us, but we had to wait until the spring. And then sure enough, as the year went on, UCLA started recruiting him and ultimately signed his teammate, Yuri Zedek, who was a big guy. But Yulo hung in there with us. And I think, his mom was a school teacher. I think, my relationship, helped, and all the time we put in. Branislav, my buddy Brandy, really helped. So, yeah, I mean, that was, that's quite a story. That was quite an adventure. And so the Yulo came, and again, he was one of the most unique players in the history of Iowa State basketball. And I mean, he's in the top 10 in almost every category, and probably should be in the Hall of Fame as well. Never missed a big shot. And quite a character. Now he's a school teacher in Western Iowa, lives out there in western part of the state. And so that class, and then Hurl was kind of the last piece of that puzzle. We kept watching Fred, and Hurl had equally as good a senior year. And what a tremendous long-range shooter, bomber that he turned into. So that group came in, and what a fun group that was. So that was kind of our last hurrah. And then our last year, we were playing great, and then Lauren got in a car accident, and that really, had that not happened, I might still be at Iowa State. But that
Coach,
kind of.
It was a great career. It was an amazing career, and you've gone on to an even amazing career post Iowa State. 18 years at Grand Valley State. Took many teams to the national tournament. Won conference titles. Through all your years coaching, and you've had a great run. Where do you rank your 14 years at Iowa State?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I really feel fortunate. All I ever wanted to be was a college coach, and I was able to do it for 40 years. So really feel fortunate. But, Iowa State certainly has a special place in my heart. Coach Orr has a special place in my heart. Took a chance on a young guy, had no really reason to, and gave me an opportunity. And, I always say I went to Ames as a young single guy, just my car and my belongings, and left there with a wife and 2 children and a mortgage. So a lot happened for me during that time. But I always think of the teams in terms of the point guards. I went from Lefty Moore to Jeff Hornacek to Terry Woods to Justice Thickman to J.C. Holloway and Jason Kimbrough. So it was a long time. It certainly was a special time, and I still feel close. And people like yourself play a big role in that. And I appreciate what you do in the Letterman's Club. And I was talking to somebody the other day about it. I don't know quite. I got a call from Lamar where I coached, and I was talking to their head coach, and appreciate him reaching out. And I said, I don't know what value it gives you to be nice to people like me, but it certainly warms my heart. And I do think there's some real value in how you all have reached back out to the former players. And Coach Prohm did a great job of that while he was there. And you and Lindsey Long in your office have done a great job. So I don't know if that's monetary value, but it certainly has human emotional value. So, I set my camera up so you could see that piece of the floor.
I see it. I noticed it.
That was my last days there. Dan Settle and Gene Politar, who were the head of the Cyclone Club. That was one of the last things on the day Tim Floyd was announced, and I knew that, my time here has ended. They gave me that piece of floor, and man, I tell you what, I still look at that, and that was so meaningful to me, because basically it was just during that time we kind of got lost in that shuffle, but it was them saying thanks for the effort, and that's all you really want as a coach, is to know that you were appreciated. And I'm going to turn my camera a little bit. I've got all my Iowa State teams here. They're on my wall. So think about you often, think about Ames often, and certainly still connected to the vast majority of those players and proud of what they've gone on to do. So let's hope this is the year the Cyclones go all the way.
Yeah. Well, Coach, I really appreciate the kind words, and I appreciate your time, and it's been so fun to catch up with you. You were a big part of our history, and we'll never forget that. So thanks again for joining us, Rick.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Have a great day.